Hello everyone, today I have an amazing story for this. The air inside the concrete subterranean bunker was thick with the scent of ozone, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of overheating servers, hummed a low, vibrating drone that seemed to rattle the very fillings in Julian's teeth. He sat slumped in a high-backed, ergonomic chair that had long since lost its lumbar support, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the glowing amber hue of a vintage cathode ray monitor that flickered erratically against the damp, unpainted cinder block wall. To his left, a massive bank of mainframe computers from a bypassed era blinked with a rhythmic, hypnotic sequence of emerald LEDs, casting long, dancing shadows across a floor littered with crumpled blueprints, half-empty energy drink cans, and discarded motherboard components. Across the cluttered, zinc-topped workbench, Marcus was furiously soldering exposed copper wire into the chassis of a heavily modified satellite transceiver. His magnifying visor flipped down over his eyes, reflecting the sharp, blinding blue sparks that periodically erupted from his iron. Neither man had spoken in over 14 hours. The silence between them weighted by the terrifying realization that the data streaming across their encrypted network was not a glitch, nor a localized anomaly, but the first digital footprint of an impending global blackout. Julian rubbed his temples, feeling the gritty texture of dried sweat and dust on his forehead, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for a lukewarm mug of black coffee that had a thin film forming over its surface. He took a slow, deliberate sip, grimacing at the bitterness before setting it back down precisely on a faded coffee ring that had stained a schematic diagram of the Atlantic fiber optic array. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and dry in the claustrophobic space, and remarked that the signal variance had just crossed the critical 3% threshold, meaning the automated firewalls of the eastern seaboard were beginning to collapse under their own weight. Marcus didn't look up from his soldering, his hand remaining remarkably steady, despite the exhaustion lines etched deep into his weathered face. But his voice carried a sharp, cynical edge when he replied that those firewalls were built by bureaucrats who believed a digital storm could be contained by a handful of corporate passwords. Marcus set the soldering iron back into its cradle, flipped up his magnifying visor to reveal eyes heavy with dark circles, and stared at the central monitor where a line graph was steadily flatlining into a terrifying, unreadable void. The heavy steel blast door at the far end of the bunker groaned as the external hydraulic pressure shifted, a sound that made both men instantly freeze, their breath catching in their throats as they listened to the muffled, metallic clunking of the locking pins moving outside. Julian's hand instinctively drifted toward the underside of the desk, where a cold, heavy tactical flashlight was magnetized to the frame. His muscles tensing for a confrontation he knew they were entirely unprepared to handle. The groaning subsided into a low hiss of releasing pneumatic pressure, followed by the slow, agonizing creak of the massive door swinging inward, revealing the silhouette of a woman drenched in rain, her dark trench coat dripping water onto the pristine concrete threshold. It was Eleanor, her breathing ragged and uneven, her face pale beneath the flickering halogen hallway light, as she stepped inside and slammed her palm against the emergency override button, sealing the heavy door behind her with a definitive, echoing thud that seemed to cut them off from the rest of the world entirely. She leaned her back against the cold steel, closing her eyes for a brief second to gather her composure before sliding down to a crouch, clutching a heavy waterproof military-grade hard drive against her chest, as if it were the last fragile remnant of human civilization. Marcus stepped away from his workbench, his boots crunching loudly on a stray piece of glass tubing as he crossed the room toward her, his expression a mix of intense relief and mounting dread, because her early return meant the extraction team at the surface had either succeeded beyond measure or had been entirely compromised. He reached out a calloused hand to help her up, noting the dark smudge of carbon scoring on the sleeve of her coat, a clear sign that she had been forced to bypass the burning wreckage of the primary uplink station up on the ridge. Elena accepted his hand, pulling herself up with a winced expression that suggested a bruised rib, and walked unsteadily toward the main console, where she placed the heavy hard drive directly between Julian's coffee mug and the flickering amber monitor. She looked at both of them, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper as she explained that the surface was already dark, that the grid had failed 3 hours ahead of the projected timeline, and that the military was currently enforcing a blackout perimeter around the entire valley. Julian's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard, the loud, rhythmic clacking filling the bunker like a burst of erratic gunfire, as he initiated the hardware handshake protocols to interface with Elena's retrieved drive. The amber monitor flashed violently, the text shifting from a steady scroll to a chaotic cascade of corrupted hexadecimal code that began to overwrite their local storage arrays at an alarming velocity. He swore under his breath, his eyes darting across the screen as he realized the data on the drive wasn't a passive archive of the event, but a highly volatile, self-replicating algorithm that was actively seeking an exit node to the global satellite network. Marcus lunged across the desk, his hand slamming down onto the main power breaker for the external transceiver array, cutting the physical connection just as a blinding white flash erupted from the secondary transformer box in the corner of the room, filling the air with the suffocating smell of burning plastic and vaporized copper. The sudden loss of the secondary systems plunged the bunker into a deep, ominous crimson hue as the emergency backup batteries kicked in, casting long, bloody shadows across the three figures who now stood entirely isolated in the subterranean dark. The amber monitor was the only light source left unchanged, its screen now displaying a single static prompt that demanded a dual-layer cryptographic key that neither Julian nor Marcus possessed. Elena leaned over the console, her face illuminated by the harsh orange glow, and stated with absolute finality that the key wasn't a piece of software, but a physical sequence locked inside the mainframe of the old naval communication array 3 miles north through the abandoned mining tunnels. Julian looked from the screen to the dark, gaping maw of the service tunnel entrance at the back of the bunker, realizing that the digital battle they had been fighting from the safety of their keyboards had just transformed into a desperate physical race against time through the freezing subterranean dark. Would you like me to continue the story continuously into the next act, expanding on their journey through the tunnels? Let me know, and I will keep writing.